So today we are talking about conflict, specifically how to define the conflict that will happen in your story. So conflict is anything that stands in the way of the character reaching their goal, or anything that causes some kind of struggle or obstacle that your character needs to deal with or overcome. Now, what I'm going to do in today's episode is, if you remember from last week's episode, I did some brainstorming activities by using the free writing and what if methods to get some general ideas for the story that I want to do for my Writing Journey 2.0 project. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to take all the notes that I made last week and I'm going to use them to define the conflict for my story. And by doing that, I will be able to have a clearer focus of the other key elements that I want to include in my story as well. And that will be with the characters, the plot, and the setting. So first, I'm going to just quickly walk you through the different types of conflict that I'm going to focus on, and to help you understand why I would want to break it up like this, because this makes it a whole lot easier to make sure that all the elements of your story are well defined and have as much necessary and meaningful detail, because this is the thing that conflict does. Conflict creates the meaning in your story and is the glue that holds everything together, that propels it forward. Without conflict, nothing happens in your story. So let's talk about the 5 different types of conflict that I'm going to use today, and I'm going to suggest that you use when you plan out your story as well. Now, if you want to follow along or use this template that I'm using here today, I have linked it in the description down below. So let's get to it. Alright, so the first type of conflict that we're going to look at is man versus self. And man versus self conflict is the conflict between the character and their inner self, or their internal conflict. This is things like abandonment, trust issues, pride, greed, duty, etc. And this is the type of conflict that will help you to define your character arcs within your story. Now remember, this whole exercise today is not just specific to one character. You can do this for multiple characters or multiple plot lines. This is also just a brain dump, but it's more focused. It is more targeted to getting to the right setting, the right plot, and the right characters for the story that you want to tell. Because your story starts and ends with conflict. Nothing in your story happens and the story doesn't go anywhere without conflict. So, first we've got man versus self conflict. Next we have man versus man conflict. And that is conflict between the character and another character. So this can be, for example, conflict between your main character and their love interest. This could be the conflict between the main character and their friends or their family, or even with the antagonist. This is all the types of relationships that you want to include in your story, and the conflict that goes along with it that drives it forward, because that's the key. We want to move and drive the story forward, and you do that by having meaningful conflict. So you want to link the conflict with the characters all the time. So the man versus man conflict is things like clashing personalities, betrayals, mistrust, things like that. The next type of conflict is man versus society, and that is conflict between the character and the society or the people around them. So this is things like social standing, religious views, cultures, certain biases that your characters might have, or anything related to your characters' interactions with their people, other peoples, like different races or different cultures or different religious views or anything like that that might stir up some conflict. That is where the man versus society comes in. The next type of conflict that we're going to look at is man versus nature. And that is conflict between the character and the world around them. Now, the man versus nature and man versus society conflicts, those are the ones that will help you to define your setting, because your setting is made up of society and nature. So by determining the conflict of these two, you can help to determine what type of setting would fit with the type of story that you want to tell. So, for examples, for the man versus nature conflict is climate, the terrain, natural disasters like snowstorms, hurricanes, tornadoes, earthquakes, things like that, and even the fauna and flora. Are there certain plants that are poisonous to your character? Or are they able to drink the water that flows through their village? Things like that. That can create conflict that you can use to drive the story forward. Now, the final type of conflict is man versus fate. Now, I like to call this the author's hand, because this is the conflict between the character and the plot. And you as the author create events and circumstances that forces the character to make choices. So this is the kinds of conflict that's about the choices that your main character or other characters make throughout your story, and also the events that take place and forces your character to deal with it. Remember, conflict is anything that causes an obstacle or a struggle in the path of your character towards reaching their goals. And by breaking it down into these 5 different conflict types, it just makes it so much easier to get to what you want your characters to be, who you want your characters to be, what you want your plot to look like, and what your world or your setting needs to be to facilitate the story that you want to tell. As you will see in the template that I've created, there is space for each of the different types of conflict. We have the man versus self, man versus man, man versus society, man versus nature, and man versus fate. Now, the idea is to list out or write out what types of conflict you want in this specific type to be included in your story. If I'm looking at the man versus self, which is the internal conflict of the character, you can split it up and say, okay, I want my main character to deal with this, and I want my villain to deal with this, or I want my love interest to deal with this. Or you can just brainstorm a whole bunch of different conflicts that you want included in the story. The reason why we want to figure these things out separately is because it will help you to get a clearer picture of the kinds of characters that you want to include in your story. We go through each of the types of conflict. We see if there's anything within those lists that we can tweak or change up a bit or use to create the conflict that we want to create. The best thing for you to do here is to write down as many options as you can, because remember, your story doesn't just have one central conflict and no other conflict. The conflict needs to bold and bold and bold throughout. So yes, it's good to have a broad idea of this is my story's main conflict, but as the story progresses, you want to raise the stakes for your characters and for your story. And by doing that, you need to introduce conflict that has bigger consequences, or not necessarily bigger consequences, but you have to build on the conflict from the start to the finish. And you do that by introducing these little snippets of conflict that you generate through these lists. So I am going to take my lists of ideas from last week's episode, and I'm just going to create a couple of options for the different types of conflict. So I'm going to set myself a timer, and I am going to fill these out. Let's get to it. now that I have some ideas of the different types of conflict that I want to include, what I'm going to do next week, and what I'm looking forward to quite a bit, is I am going to look at the characters that I want to include in my story. And I'm going to do that by taking into account the man versus self conflict and the man versus man conflict. I'm going to take the man versus self and man versus man conflict that I have determined, and I am going to build my characters. I am going to see what types of characters do I need in order to facilitate the different types of conflict that I want to include throughout my story. And by doing that, I will have characters, whether it's the main character or the antagonist or the love interest or even just the side characters. All the characters will play a role that will drive the story forward by using the conflict that are connected to all the different parts of the story. And this is why I start my planning with the conflict instead of starting it with one of the other elements, because the conflict connects the character with the setting, with the plot. And if you have a connected setting, connected plot, connected characters, all of them connected to the conflict, then you can build a story that moves forward, that's exciting and meaningful. Now, I'm not saying that this is the only way that you can plan a story, because there are a million ways out there for how you can do it. I just found that it's much easier for me to start with the conflict and then build the other elements from there. Because to come up with another element, let's say I have my main character figured out, and now I have to superimpose a conflict that will make the story happen or that fits with the story. It's much harder that way, because you inadvertently change things about the character that you spent weeks creating in order for that conflict to make sense for the person that you create. So I start with the conflict and I see, okay, what needs to happen? Who needs to be involved in this? And where do they need to be for the conflict to happen? And then I build those things. Then I can arrange the story so that the conflict builds and I take the reader through a journey. So I really hope that you enjoyed today's episode. And if you did, I would really appreciate it if you would consider subscribing and clicking the notification bell so you don't miss out on next week's episode, where we will talk about creating meaningful and connected, realistic characters. I'm looking forward to seeing you all there next week, and please remember that this template is down in the description below for you to check out. So until next time, may your creativity flow freely and your fingers dance upon the keys. Keep writing with joy and stay connected. Cheers.